we'll say who we are in just a bit, but this is part one of a two-part series on trans awareness. So what we're going to cover today are the basics. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with our program, but we are the Ontario Harm Reduction Network. I'll explain this throat clearing in a second. But what we do is we help build capacities and skills for service providers around the province to better understand the impacts of drug stigma and harm reduction, with the end goal that people who use drugs are better supported. And how this fits in with all that is actually next week's webinar series called The Beyond. I'll explain more detail what we're covering in this week's and next week's, but next week it's going to be a lot more focused on support services for trans folks who use drugs and possibly using street hormones, et cetera, et cetera. But today, before we can get to that talk next week, we need to make sure we're sort of all on the same level. My name is Francisco Sapp. I actually used to go by Frankie. And I've been in the harm reduction and HIV field for over 15 years. I am a lot older than I look. It's the beautiful Filipino genes that I've been blessed with. I still get carded for cigarettes. Don't judge me for smoking. That's what I need to do. And also, as you've noticed, I clear my throat and I twitch. I'm very active. I have Tourette's, and that's where that comes from. So there's a little nice note in the bottom that says, Frankie has Tourette's. He twitches and clears his throat a lot. While this may be distracting for viewers, living with Tourette's has made him really hilarious. So enjoy. And for any of those, we're going to be debunking a lot of myths and stereotypes. So the stereotype that I most often deal with Tourette's is the unintentional or the uncontrollable swearing. So I'm here to warn you that all of my cussing is totally on purpose. And over to my fabulous co-facilitator.
So my name is Celestina Madry. I go by Tina for short. I've been in harm reduction for only about 3 years now. I'm still pretty young, so my career is in its early stages, but it's rising, great opportunities, including this. I could not be happier to have this wonderful opportunity to educate all of you wonderful folks from all around the province.
Thank you. We're going to get to who all of you are in just a bit, but I wanted to flag a couple of items for you guys. There will be certificates of completion that are available upon request. The instructions are at the end of the presentation. Yes, you have to put up with all my dad jokes for the next 2 hours. And we'll also let you know that if you're participating in both Part 1 and Part 2, you can just send one request for the certificate. Sorry, after they're completed. We have the PDF of the slides in the resource box, and there's lots of handouts and resources. I'll walk you through everything that's included later on. So before we go much further, I'm going to hand it over to my other fabulous colleague and co-worker, Nick, who's going to walk us through, if you're new to this platform, all the tools that we can utilize and provide.
Hi folks, Nick here. It's great to see so many people on the webinar, and we'll see in a minute where we're all from. But we did drive onto this, or we facilitated this earlier this week, or on Tuesday, and we had representation from across the entire province. So it's great. if you haven't used this platform before, it's relatively straightforward. You can see who's participating up in the top right corner there under the attendees. If you want to connect with someone privately, just copy your mouse over them and you can start a private chat. If you just want to throw in a question for the discussion, the whole group, or add a comment as we're going, we're encouraging lots of engagement here. You can do that in the discussion pod on the left. But again, sometimes people don't want to ask questions out loud or to the group, so feel free to private message either myself or Kim maybe, and we'll keep an eye on those questions in the chat. We also have the ability, if you want to get on, if it's going to be a more complicated question or comment, you can raise your hand. So at the top of the screen there, you'll see a little person with their hand raised. Click on that and you can raise that hand and we'll get you on the phone line. That alerts us to get on the phone. And then in the bottom right corner, you can see all the resources. So you should be able to download any of those right now as we go throughout the presentation. But we will send those to you after the fact too. So once we finish this, we are going to record the webinar and we will send out a recording so you can watch it again, share with people that aren't able to make it, and we'll include a link to all those resources. Okay.
And for those of you in the future who are watching the recording of this, that Dropbox or that window box of resources is live even during the recording, so feel free to download as we go. You're welcome.
I just want to double check that people can see the if I see that Kayla maybe from Public Health in Sudbury District, just typed. Kayla, if you're there, can you tell me if on the screen you can see it says Adobe Connect and it's sort of a screenshot of the layout? Or does it still take introductions? So yeah, anyone, does the slide show Adobe Connect, or does it show you, does it have introductions still written on it? Okay, cool, great, that's fine, thank you. Okay, so I'll hand it back over to Frankie.
All right. So the goal of this really is about learning the language, more inclusive, language and terms, really understanding the complexities that a lot of trans and non-binary folks experience often daily, and then to build our skills in terms of how to be a better ally. So we're going to walk you through some key terms. One of the handouts that you'll receive later on is a full definition list of a lot more terms. We're going to talk about the important difference between sexuality and gender identity, pronouns, and then bathrooms, transphobia, the different levels of it. And we're talking about questions that trans folks are often asked, and then end with being a trans ally. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but if your question is relevant to what we're currently presenting on, please feel free to type that in the chat box. Either Nick or Kim will alert us and let us know there's a question. As I mentioned earlier, next week, Beyond, just a deeper dive. It's really understanding the environment, the social context, and what a lot of trans and non-binary folks are dealing with. We're going to look at the barriers that many of us experience in services. And then finally, for those of you who are harm reduction workers who provide medical supplies and equipment, we're going to talk about what equipment you can have available in your harm reduction rooms to be more inclusive and accommodating of trans folks. And I just realized one thing I forgot to mention, so FYI, one of the reasons why I helped develop this presentation and why it matters so much to me is I am surprise trans. So, hey, it's okay. I have a right to talk about this.
Yes, I am also trans, so that's also a reason that I'm doing this webinar.
Cheers, queers. Okay. So for in the beyond, a lot of folks are often curious about medical transition options, and we are going to lay that out, but more for the purpose of understanding why, if you have a lens of what folks might desire, you can understand how important that is when we talk about mental health and how that impacts it because of the barriers that a lot of us often receive. And then again, we're going to talk about some harm reduction equipment, and then we're going to go over some tips and tools for how to make your services and your organizations more accessible. So our first poll, this is just a quiz. It helps us know who's around the province, what's going on, where are you? Let me know. We want to know. Okay, it looks like we have a pretty good cross-section. And I'm going to ask you another question. It's also helpful for us to know how you rate your current knowledge. Okay, a lot of average, pretty decent amount of basic, and hello to the almost 2% of non-existent. Welcome, so glad that you're here. And I really believe that even if your knowledge level is more advanced, that there's always something you can learn. The reason we have two people co-facilitating is we're two individual peoples. Sure, we'll go with that. We're two individual people, and we have different perspectives, different life experiences, different stories, and different points to add. Okay, I didn't warn you there's a quiz. That's why it's called a pop quiz. So we're going to see how you're doing in terms of your knowledge level here.
So the first question in our pop quiz is the concept of Western society in which people are raised as either a boy or a girl, depending on what sex you are assigned at birth. This forms the basis for your gender, how you present, how you behave, what you wear, how you are educated, what jobs you can or are expected to do, and who you should be attracted to, /love, /marry, etc. Sounds very dystopian when you put it that way.
I like to think that we're living in doom. That's jokes, but I've never actually seen a movie. All right, so it looks like most of you got it right. It is the gender binary system. And this is really critical because there's a theory that we have that Tina's going to walk us through about how really the gender binary system is the root of a lot of the oppression a lot of us experience. And speaking of, just because we're on the gender binary system, there's a fantastic gender comic in your resources box that I highly recommend downloading, blowing up, and framing, and passing out maybe at the busy corner in your town. All right, next one.
So the next multiple choice question is a person who feels that their assigned or that their gender identity.
Sorry, wait. Okay. Go ahead. Okay, now we're good.
A person who feels that their gender identity does not match their assigned sex most take hormones and or have surgery to make their bodies look more male or female.
And just letting you know, guys, these are anonymous, so please vote honestly. You don't need to Google the definition to make sure you get an A++. I will love you even with a C-. Okay, so majority of you guys said transgender. Tina, was that the right answer?
Not quite. The answer is transsexual.
And I find that Tina has a really great explanation.
Yes. So the reason why, or the difference between transgender and transsexual is a transgender is an umbrella term that refers to anybody whose gender does not quite match the one they were assigned at birth. Transsexual, on the other hand, refers specifically to people who have taken steps to physically change their body, whether it's hormones or surgery. A good way to remember the difference is that transsexual has the word sex in it, so that means that the physical sex is changing, whereas transgender has the word gender in it, and it's an umbrella term for anybody whose gender does not match the one they're assigned at birth.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to steal that line next time I present. It's an amazing way to explain it. Now, I want to make sure that I highlight a lot of folks don't quite know the meaning of Two-Spirit. I want to flag and make you fully aware I am not Indigenous. So it is not my space to really explain the history or intent of the language around Two-Spirit, but to give you a sort of synopsis and snapshot of what it means. It's an Indigenous person who identifies either as queer or trans. So it could have to do with sexual orientation or gender identity, and we'll get into the difference between those in just a bit. But it's important to note, not everyone Indigenous who identifies as queer and or trans identifies as Two-Spirit. Definitions of the language are all very personal. So we're walking you through just a couple of key terms. But just because you might know the definition of a term may not be how that person identifies. So it's, but the other thing about Two-Spirit people is that they've been documented in over 150 tribes in North America. So I think it's pretty critical to acknowledge that. Okay, I'm going to give you another one.
So the next question is presenting oneself well enough to be seen as a member of a different sex/gender category than assigned at birth. This may also be about the perception of others. For instance, you may be seen as something other than how you identify. The term has been used across race, sexuality, and gender identity.
Okay. Doing some voting. So 80% of you guys got it right. The term is actually passing, and I think as Tina mentioned, it's important to acknowledge that sometimes it's about what you're intentionally doing, how you present yourself to the world, and sometimes it has no control. You have no control over it. And it's how other people are reading you and seeing you. And I do want to make sure that folks know the history and the root of where this term comes from. And it actually originated a while ago in the southern states to describe folks who are both black and white. And the term was used to describe those who were particularly light-skinned and able to pass as white, and therefore were able to sneak through the system and get access to work and all that sort of stuff. So that's where the root of the word comes from, and in current times it's borrowed across many dynamics and identities.
The concept of passing can also, it can be a bit of baggage in the trans community because different people have different attitudes toward it. Some people are not interested in passing. Some people think like, why should I, sanitize myself and my appearance and who I am to make myself more acceptable to others. I shouldn't have to pass to be gendered correctly and accepted for who I am. But for other people, passing can be very important and even essential because passing can be necessary to alleviate some people's dysphoria, and it can also even be a matter of safety. Sometimes the difference between passing and not passing can be the difference between being attacked or not, between being hired for a job or not. So it can be kind of perceptions of passing and the goals really varies a lot from person to person across the trans community.
And I believe we have one more.
So the next question is someone who has a gender identity that agrees with their societally recognized sex, the opposite of transgender.
All right. Looks like most of you guys are getting the answer right. Often when I present on this information, the cisgender is something that many folks have never heard of. And just to give you a little bit of translation, in Latin, cis actually means same. So you can read that as same gender. So someone is the same gender that they were assigned with at birth. So as an example, if you were assigned female at birth and you now still identify as a woman and as a female, you are a cis woman. The older terms that folks used to use might be like I'm a trans man and someone else is a real man. And meaning, that they're a biological man. And the reason why that doesn't sit right with me, for a variety of reasons, are actually, well, as we'll get into next week, the process of medically transitioning, there are so many barriers. I can't do a tease on that right now. But the old saying, your gender is between your ears and your sex is between your legs. I'm not comfortable with it. There are many people who identify as women, but she may not be able to have access to surgery or hormones if she desires. And and I think that that's important, that she may still be biologically a certain way, but she's actually recognized and valued for who she is in the world. Unless you want to add to that.
I think also, like, it's kind of funny, like, the term biological, because we're all biological. Like, sometimes people ask me, oh, are you a biological woman? I say, yeah. Or, I mean, no, I'm not a biological woman. I'm fully cyborg.
I like co-facilitators with some. Okay. So we're going to go into a few issues. And this is really going to be the bulk of the presentation. We're going to talk about gender identity, pronouns, bathrooms, and transphobia. And Tina's going to talk about, there's a lot of people get confused about the difference between sexuality and gender identity. How can someone transition and then be gay and all that sort of stuff? So Tina's going to kindly break it down for us.
So sexuality is who you go to bed with. Gender identity is who you go to bed as. And this is a quote from a YouTuber called Brandon Jordan. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And I find in my experience, when I tell people that are attracted to women, sometimes they get confused. They're like, why would you become a woman if you're attracted to women? And because it's very tied with kind of heterosexism, that people assume that if you're transitioning, that it's to be heterosexual, or in my case, like that my femininity is to attract men, or because I'm attracted to men, and that is not necessarily true. My femininity is totally a separate thing from who I'm attracted to. I've always been bisexual, and whether pre-transition and post, and that my bisexuality is a separate thing from my gender identity.
Yeah, and I have a couple of stories from friends. So I have a friend, let's call him Bob. When Bob was Barbara was into guys. Barbara didn't feel right as a woman, so became Bob. Guess what? He was still into guys. So that doesn't change. For some of us, very complicated diagram. I hope you follow along. For some of us who are trans, we do overlap as into the LGBT and all the other letters of the acronym, and that can either be pre-transition or maybe even post. I know it can get really confusing, but my story is I got sexuality and gender very confused because as a young person, we're not really given language to talk about it. And I initially came out as a queer woman, and I came out, and I've always been pretty masculine. And being a butch, what that meant was that I had all these self-imposed but also internalized from the world rules and restrictions. So as a butch woman, I never wore pink. I never had jewelry. I never had X, Y, Z. Once I started passing as male, I felt this freedom that I no longer had to prove myself. And so, I mean, I don't want to give you guys too much information because sometimes the TMI presentation that I do, but I have a very highly structured and organized closet. Color-coded, short sleeve to long sleeves, no buttons to some buttons to long buttons. It's a very, very important process to me. And I hate to break it to you, but now that I don't have to worry about proving who I am anymore, I've got pinks, purples, pastels, I've got a jewelry box, like, whoa. And it's that freedom to just be who I am, for my sake, not having to worry so much about centering how the world treats me. And so this is just some data that was taken from the TransPulse survey. One of the first of its kind. This was a research study that was conducted by trans folks for trans folks, filled out by trans folks, and it's Ontario-based. So we were able to get 432 participants. And just look at the diversity of sexual orientation, and that's just sort of proves the point that we're trying to make. Some, 30% are bisexual or pansexual, 31% are queer, 30% are straight. But I find this interesting 13% are now questioning their sexual orientation. So there really is a distinct difference.
All right, so we're going to go into some of the acronyms and gender identities. There's female to male, or FTM, or trans man. There's male to female, MTF, or trans woman. So some people don't like using the acronyms FTF or MTF because the idea is that somebody has always been their identified gender and they never were originally the birth gender. So some people just prefer the term trans man or trans woman, so which those terms don't imply that they were something else before. But other people are okay with the acronyms. So it really, I would say as a default, use the word trans man and trans woman, and they are also always with a space. They're never together. And the reason why is because when it's spelled together, for most adjectives, you don't put it into one word. For example, you wouldn't spell lesbian woman with one word. So that's the reason why they're spelled separately. That a trans man and a trans woman are not, because when you blend into one word, it seems like it's a whole separate thing that's not a man or a woman. So that's why it might seem like a very kind of nitpicky little thing, but it's actually very important that the space is there. Gender non-binary, so people who are gender non-binary do not necessarily fit cleanly into either the male or the female part of the gender binary, which is this concept that we talked about earlier. So gender non-binary people can have all kinds of identities ranging from bigender, which is that they're male and female. They could be agender, which is no gender at all. They could be a third gender, gender queer, gender fluid. That means that the person's gender kind of shifts or changes over time, from day to day, week to week, month to month. And there's really so many different varieties of identities that gender non-binary people can have. Non-binary is just the umbrella term for people who do not fit neatly into the binary. And other acronyms are assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth, which are AFAB and AMAB, respectively. And these acronyms are great alternatives to biological language. Instead of saying biologically female or biologically male, it's good to say assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. And the reason these acronyms are important is because they show that the birth gender is something that is assigned to somebody. It's not that they are female or are male, they're just assigned it, they're labeled that way. So that's why these acronyms are a very important kind of alternative to using the terms biologically female or biologically male. So we have, where's the slide card? Oh, there it is, okay. So here we have a pie chart that kind of shows, it was based on a poll from TransPulse of people's gender identity. So we have 45% who chose masculine on the poll, 35% feminine, and then 20% are either both, neither, or fluid. So that should give people an idea of kind of how many people are non-binary. It is also worth noting that the language used in this poll, masculine and male, are not necessarily the same thing. Feminine and female are not necessarily the same thing. So that's just kind of a thing to note with the language. But yeah, it looks like that is the language that they chose for the poll. All right. So realizing that you're trans, it can be very sudden or it can be very gradual. Some people gain self-awareness about their gender identity at a very young age, and it's very like they know right away. Other people, it takes quite a bit of piecing together through their life for them to figure it out. And there is no right way to be trans. People who know at an earlier age or know sooner are not more valid than people who take longer to find out. Especially when, with the gender binary system and being assigned into a gender, people who are trans are always told that they're the birth gender. There's so much pressure to be the birth gender, and all that pressure to be the birth gender can make it take a very long time for someone to put all the pieces together. And as I mentioned earlier, just because somebody transitions at a later age does not mean they are less valid. And so there's no right or wrong way to transition. Some people transition along the gender binary. Some people go from one end of the gender binary to the other end, from male to female or female to male, and they stick to the binary the whole way through. But other people don't stick to the binary. Some people might transition to either being agender, bigender, third gender, all the different identities that I mentioned earlier. Some people can be quite fluid with where they're at in terms of their gender. Gender is a spectrum or a web. So an analogy that I like to use is gender is very much like color. So if one was to say, oh, there's only two genders, male and female, that's kind of like saying, oh, there's only two colors, red and blue. So there really is a whole spectrum. Like you have, say, red and blue, which is female and male, but you also have yellow, you have orange, you have green. You can have even different shades of red and blue. You can have purple, which is like a mixture of red and blue. And you can have colors like pink, beige, and brown that have nothing to do with red and blue. And gender can also be fluid, as I mentioned earlier. A person's color can shift and change.
Thank you. I really love that analogy, and I'm so glad Tina introduced me to that. So Kayla has a question. I received a question from our intake staff. Our clinical information system only gives the option of male or female. The field is required. Good question that I'm not going to answer right now because we have a whole section on that. So hold your horses. Hopefully you have horses to hold. And what Tina is so beautiful at expressing is some of us, 8% of us knew and understood that our gender identity didn't match our body at an older age. But look at that first stat. 59, almost 60% of the 433 participants of the trans health survey knew before the age of 10. And we're going to go more into depth next week in the Beyond, understanding the impact of understanding who you are, failing to have language to understand who you are. And I just need to point that out, because how many of us below the age of 10 are struggling and not feeling like we belong? But that's also a heavily censored age period where we're not talking about different sexualities, we're not talking about different genders. And as Tina so eloquently pointed out, we're not talking about all the colors at all. So that's something that needs to shift, and I think it finally is, but we've got a long way to go. And then just again, I mentioned earlier that, surprise, surprise, Tina and I are two different people. There's so much more to who we are, each as individuals. 23% of the folks who took the survey are racialized. 7% are indigenous. There's a lot of us living with chronic disability and illness. Which I'm going to argue next week is connected to our mental health, which is connected to the social determinants of health that we experience, so on and so forth. Okay, so we're going to talk about pronouns now. So there's the ones that we're most familiar with, she or her, or he or him. There's also, and I need to be clear, this is by no means, this doesn't even scratch the surface of the beautiful ways that people are using to describe themselves. One of the earlier attempts to come up with a more gender neutral, a not binary pronoun was ze and here. So ze is a cross between a combination of she and he, and here is his or her. And these were introduced by Leslie Feinberg, who's sadly no longer with us, but I believe they went by now, were instrumental in the queer and trans movement. Leslie Feinberg authored the book Stonebush Blues, and later on a historical nonfiction book called Transgender Warriors, which depicts a history of gender variance I believe, in the world, actually. They cover many cultures. But as you can see, I have to pause and think really hard on how to pronounce those, so it didn't quite take off. So more commonly, people are using they as a pronoun when they're speaking about themselves or someone is referring to them. And it's really simple. Let's say Nick, who you can't see, but you heard his lovely voice up here, goes my name. Kim asks, you also can't see her. Kim asks, where did Nick go? And I say, they went to the bathroom. It's really as simple as that. But there may be times where you're not sure what pronoun someone uses. And please note that I said what pronoun someone uses and not a pronoun that someone prefers. The big difference for me is that a preference indicates that it's optional. So there are respectful ways, if you don't know what pronouns to use, there are respectful ways of asking and not so respectful ways of asking. Now, in this space only, and remember it's anonymous, we are going to do a little exercise, and you're going to have at us all the disrespectful ways of asking what the hell my pronoun is. Ready? And go. You can do it. I believe in you. So all you do is type in that little text box. What's the question? That's not such a nice way of asking what pronoun to use. Oh, there's like 5,000 what are yous. And that is my favorite question I've ever gotten. What are you? Are you a he or a she? A lot more what are yous. What should I call you? What do you prefer? Not as bad, but I do prefer not using prefer. See what I did there? What do you want to be referred as? Okay, that's a good go. I often get asked if I am a boy or a girl, but like I said earlier, what are you is my favorite. Okay, so now we're going to do what are some respectful ways of asking. Sorry, a minute. All right. So again, just type in the text box. What are some respectful ways of asking? your preference. What pronoun should I use to refer to you? What pronoun do you use? How would you like to be addressed? How do you identify? That's actually really interesting. Because when I was asked how I identified, I actually said Filipino. And there's so many different identities, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Oh, Christina, look at that good one. I love that. Hello, my name is Christina. My pronouns are she, her. How would you like me to address you? Okay, those are great, guys. So, all great examples. I still would work on not using the word prefer. What pronoun do you use? And if you aren't sure, you can just use their name, or you can just use gender neutral they until you have more information. Now, it's been asked before that sometimes that can be an insult to use they if you don't see someone, because they might be intending to pass and maybe they're not. And I acknowledge it's a very tricky situation. But what I like so much about Christina's example is sometimes we should be using they for almost anyone. Because how do we really know what pronoun someone uses? And I think this is really important to say because I know a lot, I mean a lot, of people who are gender binary who read and pass as a woman or a man. And I think when we're only asking people who are a little bit more androgynous what their pronoun is, I think we're not acknowledging the fluidity of gender and gender presentation and the spectrum of it. A practice that is becoming more and more common is for people to add pronouns to their email signatures, and I think that's great. Add pronouns to your name tags. It just normalizes that there's more than more than two options for gender, and that you don't have to look a certain way to not identify with those two options. That makes sense.
You know, I think it would be awesome if the English language had a feature similar to the TV system in Romance languages for pronouns, where you only use gendered pronouns if you know somebody personally, kind of like using tu in French. And then you use, there'd be like another set of pronouns that are gender neutral and perhaps different from they, that are used to honor people who you don't know as well. I feel like that would be such a useful feature to have in the English language.
Well, you're young, yeah, as you pointed out, so invent that. Work on that, go. Well, we have to acknowledge that changing pronouns is hard. And it's okay to say that. You've known someone for 20 years, and they were Michelle, and now they're Michael. Maybe they don't look yet like Michael, or you've known them for 20 years and they do look like Michael, but you're still not in the practice of it. It takes work. But the point is you have to do that work. I'm very forgiving if you mess up. As long as I see that you're trying, I'm okay. But there is a statute of limitations of how long it can take you to get there. My former partner actually identified as gender non-binary, went by they, and looked and passed as a woman. So, this is very important that we talk about this. And I had the hardest time, me, a trans person, having a hard time using gender neutral pronouns. So what I did in the strategy is that I would just practice talking about that in the third person. I would have conversations about them internally so that when I messed up, I fixed it and corrected up here so that I messed up less externally and out loud. And that was what really helped me. But again, going back, the dangers of using the wrong pronoun and that there's a statute of limitations. I have a really good friend, let's call him Jake, and Jake had an older brother, and Jake had transitioned and as being read as male and identified as male for over 10 years, over a decade. And there Jake was with his brother, and they were at a bar. His brother was being really nice. It was like, I'll order the beers, and went to the server and said, I'll have a beer, and my sister will have the same. My sister, his sister Jake, with the full beard, the hairy ass chest, the bald head, like, and I'm not saying, you know, like just typically red male traits. And I can only imagine the amount of fear Jake must have felt. And I'll tell you my story again. TMI Frankie, King of the Four Reserves, but I'll tell you everything. And we'll get into that story a little bit later on. So practice, do the work. And just, if you, something I think is also important, part of doing that work means you're going to mess up. Because it means you're going to try, which means you're going to mess up. So what to do if you accidentally mess up? Tina, may I use you in the sample?
Of course.
So Tina, she is a great, amazing teacher and facilitator. Messed up, corrected myself, boom, moved on. What has happened far too often, in my personal experience, Tina, you're welcome to share some of yours. Someone has messed up, misgendered me, and used the wrong pronoun, and for like 15 to 30 minutes, sometimes I think it was even like 45 minutes, Joe, apologizing to me and saying how sorry they were and they felt so guilty and they'll work harder. I don't have enough facial hair yet to be read as a boy, and maybe I still had my boobs, or, you know, like all the, like this whole monologue about the difficulty for them recognizing who I am. And I love you all, or most of you, but I ain't got time for that. Do your work, correct yourself, and just move on. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Dragging it, although it's well-intentioned, you know, you might feel bad, and you should feel bad, but don't feel too bad.
Yeah.
Because it is forced to habit. Some trans people, when they first come out, sometimes they even misgender themselves by it, just because of habit. So, like, it's, so yeah, it's like total force of habit. That is a thing. Us trans people, we get it. But don't draw it out too long. The more you draw it out, the more awkward it gets. And especially if you're like in public or something, as Frankie was saying, it exposes the fact that you're trans to all these bystanders. And the more you apologize and drag it out, the more apparent that is to the bystanders. It's one of the reasons it's great to just be like, like just apologize quickly, say I mean, and then say the correct one, is because any bystander might think that, oh, that person just made a mistake. Because, I mean, I'm sure everybody...
People mess up more often than not.
Yeah. Even just like if you're having a brain fart, you know, like I'm sure everybody has accidentally misgendered as this person just from like having a brain fart or, you know, being tired. So if one just, I mean, and apologize or doesn't drag on the apology, it can make it seem like, oh, this is just a little brain fart.
Yeah.
Just like, yeah, make it slide. Don't make it too awkward, and just the magic words are, I mean, insert correct pronouns there, and then move on.
And you're feeling really guilty. Instead of your 15-minute monologue, I gladly accept donations to Starbucks. Okay. So now we're going to get into something really critical, and again, I'm going to hand it over to Tina to share some beautiful analogies she's going to share.
So this is going to be kind of a visual exercise, and to use one's imagination. In my experience, I find the best way to like depict what having gender dysphoria is like with this person is imagine if you were strapped down in a chair and injected with the wrong hormone and the changes start happening. So if you're a cisgender woman, imagine how awful it would feel that you touch your face and prickly, it feels like sandpaper, that your arms are bulky and they're not soft anymore, and just that you have hair all over your arms, all over your chest. Like imagine just like tactile and like that there's a bump in your throat and it feels like your throat's closing up because the cartilage is way too big over there. Like imagine just how uncanny that would feel and how awful that would feel. And because of these traits, people don't believe you when you say, hey, I've always been a woman, like, or I've always been a man. Say if we go the other way, you know, you don't have that scruff. You're weirdly soft, and when you stand up, you lean forward because, wow, you have this unexpected weight on your chest. So imagine just how uncanny and how uncomfortable and how horrible it would feel. And I think it's also worth mentioning that cisgender people can have conditions that cause similar kind of feelings. Like some cis women grow facial hair, some cis men have breasts, and cisgender people get the same procedures. Cisgender men with gynecomastia, they can get top surgery. Cisgender women who have facial hair, they get it removed. So, and the reason why they do that is for similar reasons, because those features make them uncomfortable. But it is worth noting that at least as a cis person, you do have the privilege of people believing you when you say, oh, I'm actually this gender because you were assigned that gender. Whereas if you're trans, it's a lot harder to get people to believe you. So there's different kinds of dysphoria. There's physical dysphoria, which is the discomfort that comes with one's physical traits and physical features, generally sexually dimorphic features. So sexually dimorphic means any physical traits that generally have different averages with men and women. There's also social dysphoria. Social dysphoria has to do with how other people relate to you, how people refer to you, and how people see you. And then there's ego dysphoria. Ego dysphoria is kind of existential or ontological, and it has to do with the sense of dissonance that you are not your true self or that you are not authentically who you could be. And not every trans person will have all three kinds of dysphoria. There's a big kind of controversy in the trans community as to whether you need dysphoria to be trans. My opinion is not necessarily, because the word dysphoria means extreme suffering, and the suffering doesn't always have to be extreme. As I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of fluidity. Some people might be mildly uncomfortable, but other people might be extremely distraught. So dysphoria, the word dysphoria is the opposite of euphoria. So I'm sure, so usually the word euphoria is used to refer to like good drug experiences, but actually the word euphoria just means for any reason that you feel transcendently blissful and happy. So gender euphoria generally happens when a transgender person begins to take steps to align themselves with who they actually are. And for some people, they might not have dysphoria. They might actually realize that they're trans when they, say, put on a dress for the first time or cut their hair for the first time, and they have euphoria and something clicks, and they're like, oh, this feels great. So yeah, sometimes there might not be any gender dysphoria. There can be the gender euphoria might be the trigger that makes someone realize that they're trans.
And that was a big awakening for me, because I didn't realize how much gender dysphoria I had experienced in a lot of my youth and childhood until I had top surgery. I mean, when I was a teenager, I wore shirts that were 5 times as big as they were. I had chronic bad posture from slouching over to hide my chest. And then even now, and I had, again, we'll talk about, medical transition options more next week. But even today, when I look in the mirror and see that the shirt fits flat on me, I mean, I experience gender dysphoria like daily. And it makes me sad in retrospect for all the dysphoria that I had previously lived through. Okay. I don't know if you guys are ready for this jelly. We are going to pause and talk about bathrooms. This slide here is really indicative of a lot of my life and the choices that I were often being forced to make. Because most bathrooms are gendered for men and women, even if they're single stalls. And please explain to me, dear Ontario, if there's a toilet and a seat in this bathroom, and a toilet and a sink in this bathroom, why in the world can only men use this one and only women use this one? It doesn't make absolutely any sense, and I think it's really important to note that the Ontario Human Rights Code actually states that everyone has a right to use the gender that matches their gender identity. But a lot of us might not choose to do that because of safety. So when I wasn't passing as male, and I was using the women's room, I had police called on me, I had security called on me, I had little children screaming, I had mothers attacking me, I had my hair pulled. I mean, every time I went to the bathroom, it was like I had to take a deep breath. Before top surgery, I would sort of like hoist my chest up as high as possible. And even if I wasn't menstruating at the time, I'd have like a tampon baton like in my arm that I'd marched into the bathroom like I belong here. And it was really quite an ordeal. And when I started using the men's room, it wasn't as stressful, but there were more times than I was comfortable with, for obvious reasons. When I was discovered, and I almost got jumped a couple of times in 2 different public washrooms and in a change room. And so going back to the key terms, by definition, I fit transsexual. I was assigned female. I'm now going by male in my life and on my identification, but I actually don't identify with transsexual at all. I identify as trans, very much gender non-binary. I don't feel like a man or a woman. I've never felt like a man or a woman. I remember in high school really struggling, and I would actually look at pictures of myself, and I would point at myself and actually say, woman, and that didn't feel right. And then I tried man, and that didn't feel right either. Like I just felt like me. And when I had my surgeries, and I had, particularly when my chest was removed, I was so elated. I experienced that gender euphoria, so I was totally fine with who I was. But because of the bathrooms, I felt I needed to go on hormones to look more male, to pass easier, to finally feel safer, taking a piss and walking down the street. And it's tremendous now that I pass. Walking down the street, and I feel this huge weight just lifted from my body. Like, sometimes I don't realize how much stress I'm actually under until I'm no longer in that stress. And it was daily, it was decades long. So this is a really important point for me to hit home. And excuse me, we have lots of great handouts. This one was one that I found at a local university about what to do and what not to do. If you find someone, you think someone's in the wrong bathroom, I encourage you to print out those resources, print them out, post them in the washrooms, and help people along. And later in the Ally Tips, we'll come and revisit what you can do further. And this is so impactful that it's actually having medical impact on it. Because we're constantly trying to assess whether or not we feel safe enough to go into the restroom. Many of us might be holding it in. Leading to bladder infections, UTIs, kidney infections, and even urinary stones. And the opposite can be happening for some of us who we're not drinking enough water or other fluid so that we don't have to pee all the time, and then we experience chronic dehydration. And that's how big of a deal the bathrooms are for many of us. I like this practical acknowledgement. Tina's going to read.
I'm more worried about people who don't wash their hands in public washrooms than I am about what's inside their underwear. Relax, they just want to pee.
Yeah, and if you missed, for whatever reason, the earlier point I made, the entire reason I went on and am on hormones so I can use a public washroom. This is my personal favorite time.
This bathroom has been liberated from the gender binary.
Ooh. Yay. And I hope that we all are one day, but some folks asked a nice way, a recommended way to identify a bathroom that's gender neutral, and we did add a sign. It's specifically for accessibility bathrooms, because one of the ways we can lobby to get gender neutral, single stall, gender neutral washrooms is advocating that there aren't enough accessible washrooms. So there is a sign that you can use that just talks about the labels the bathroom as gender neutral. There's there's homo work. We're going to get to that later. So we're going to move on to this, and I'm going to let Tina take it over.
So in terms of outing folks, don't out people as trans. So for those who don't know, outing means revealing somebody's identity, whether it's gender or sexual orientation, or things like HIV status, all kinds of different identities. So don't tell other people a person is trans unless they've given you permission to. So earlier in my transition, often when people would introduce me, and it was often very well intentioned, they're like, oh, this is my trans friend, Tina. She's trans. She transitions. Trans. And it's kind of insulting because it's like I am a lot more than just trans, and it kind of makes somebody feel like a circus when they are introduced that way. Don't tell other people that a person is trans unless that person explicitly has given you permission to do so. And if you know a person before they came out as trans, don't use their old names or pronouns unless the person specifically told you that that's okay. So, and that's also another way that people can be outed. So, so instead of saying that's Michelle, but I knew her when she was Mike, you can just say that's Michelle. Or even say if you're referring to somebody's childhood, still use their current name and pronoun. And yeah, that's basically all there is to it.
I have an interesting story. I had a really good friend who brought them over to my apartment and we watched a movie together. And when they went home, the good friend wound up telling this person who I just met that I was trans, and for the remainder of the time that I knew this person, like, he met me as me, how I look today. I perfected my 5 o'clock shadows for this broadcast, like no chest, all that stuff. He suddenly switched to calling me she because he couldn't unsee that I wasn't male or born male. And I asked my friend not to ever do that again. He was like, why? And I'm like, that's not your place. That's my story.
Yeah, I can definitely relate with the people aren't able to unsee things. Because, like, a big part of this is, like, if somebody wants to pass, this can really impede the effort. Like, most people, when they see me, don't notice that I have an enlarged bump in my throat. But if somebody says, oh, this is Tina, my trans friend, they're going to look for stuff like that, and they will notice. Yeah. And that will make me feel insecure. And just, it'll make me feel sad. So, yeah, don't do that.
And just on that note, this is kind of a big deal for me. I don't know about you, Tina, and we can't take up too much time, but when I'm doing this training in person, I'm like, you know, it's cool that I'm out in public ways in certain settings. But if you see me at a Starbucks, don't be like, yo, Frank, great trans presentation or whatever. Because, again, the whole reason I went on hormones was to pass, not because I identify as a guy, but to be seen as a guy so that I can live more safely in this world. And anything that compromises that, it isn't okay.
So transphobia is a fear, disgust, stereotyping, or hatred of transgender, transsexual, or other gender non-traditional individuals because of their perceived gender identity, expression, or status. Transphobia can either be direct or indirect.
And this is where we get to that big theory that I introduced at the beginning of the presentation. I don't know, Tina, do you want me to do it? I know that.
Sure, I'll do it.
Okay.
So,
best friends always share.
All right. So we start with the gender binary system. There we go. So we start with the gender binary system. As I explained earlier, this is in Western society that puts everyone into male or female, and that leads to gender roles and expectations, which then leads to genderism. And genderism is, we like to use this term as kind of an alternative term to sexism, because sexism implies that the physical sex is the end-all and be-all of why people are discriminated, when really gender also has a big part to do with it as well. So genderism leads to transphobia, homophobia, and biphobia. So as we mentioned earlier, homophobia and biphobia they overlap a lot with the gender binary. And the reason why is because being heterosexual is a gender role. If you are assigned female at birth, you're expected to be into men. If you're assigned male at birth, you're expected to be into women. And just the very act of being attracted to a gender that you are not, that your assigned gender is not supposed to be attracted to is even that in of itself crosses gender roles. Because if you like men, as a man, you're doing something womanly by liking men, and vice versa. I remember earlier in my life, when I was a teenager and I started presenting more and more feminine, and I started embracing my feminine side, the insults that I got were not necessarily trans-related insults. They were more about how I was gay, that my femininity was seen as being because I was gay. And because people thought that that my femininity was because I liked men, and me liking men was why I was feminine, which, as I explained earlier, is not necessarily the case. So transphobia, homophobia, and biphobia are all very interlinked with each other for this reason.
Now we're making a good time. Hopefully you guys are learning from this, but I just want to remind you, if you have questions that are related to the topic that we're on, please go ahead. If not, if you have questions that we can answer later on the road, feel free to type them in the chat box, and then we'll get flagged for Tina and I to answer later. But speaking of what Tina was talking about, some of our gender roles are very outdated. So that's just a fun little comment. And it does look like there's a lot of advancements, but there's still really a long, long, long way to go. Now, the important when we're talking about transphobia, this is my personal view. So the acronym LGBT, it's quite longer than that. You don't have time to go through all the letters of the alphabet. That's an entirely different workshop. But what really, really bothers me is when LGBT is used, we're LGBT allies, we're LGBT support services, but you actually have no services or resources for the T. In my personal opinion, if your services are primarily and exclusively for people with various sexual orientations and identities, that's okay. Say that. I mentioned earlier, I live with a lot of chronic illness and disabilities. I don't have time to go to your organization if you say you're LGBT, offer LGBT services, but you actually don't offer anything related to my concerns or issues with my gender identity. Just be transparent and be honest. And a lot of shift is happening, and the gender identity disorder was listed in the DSM. Excuse me. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that psychiatrists use to diagnose people with mental illness. And I need to acknowledge that there are a lot of trans folks and non-binary folks who are against it. I know exactly who I am. I don't have mental health concerns. But, and here's the catch, and again we'll go more in depth into this next week, but some trans folks were for a gender identity disorder to be in the DSM because that's what OHIP used to fund the Gender Identity Clinic at CAMH, which is a mental health organization, to fund medically transition options. So it's kind of a catch-22. And I think it's interesting, just talking about the shift in language. Gender identity disorder is now listed as gender dysphoria. So not a disorder. May seem subtle, but it's important. And sex reassignment surgery is now called gender reconstruction surgery or gender affirming surgery. So I see it. Can we mention that the gender binary came along with the truth? It is not somehow inherent understanding it. It is an imposed system. Jan, you can mention that all you want. I'm not going to go there right now, but that doesn't mean I disagree. There's only so many cans of worms I can open during this limited time. So continuing on with transphobia. It's important to know there's like sort of direct and intentional and indirect and maybe perhaps unintentional. Being called it or he, she, or she, he, or train are more blatant and direct insults and transphobia. But there's also the subtle end. And many of us may not, like we keep talking about the creatures of habit, we may not think about the implications of our marriage. But for me to be referred to as a trans man, if I identified as a man, I know this gets confusing and complicated, but let's just say for the sake of argument that I do. I'm a trans man and Nick is a real man. What does that suggest for someone who's identified as a man since they were 3 years old? And I think it's a fun way of marking difference and of marking otherness. See what I did there? I came dressed for the occasion. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a good thing to keep in mind that when you're talking to a human being, you shouldn't use words like real, because everybody's real. Yeah, like it's okay to use, say, for example, if you're eating a Beyond Burger and you're like, oh wow, this fake burger tastes so much like the real thing. That's okay, because you're not hurting the burger's feelings. But when you're doing that to a person, that's just, you're hurting their feelings, and it's just not good.
And I think it's also, like one of the points we keep trying to make and interject into this presentation is that there's no right way to do something. And so giving someone the validity of being real and not real questions that process, that we all can be where we are on the spectrum. There's another question. So what if a person decides to use it as a pronoun? Then you respect that and you use it. It's very tricky, but language is individual and personal. I can't recommend calling someone it if you don't know them. But it's a totally legit question. Working in harm reduction, I'm uncomfortable with labeling people as addicts. And even if they identify themselves as an addict, that might not be language I borrow, but I'm also not going to be like, you shouldn't call yourself addict. You know, that's not my place. That's their identity. That's their struggle. And language, again, is very personal. Okay. So the last point that I want to talk about in terms of impacts of transphobia, because how does this manifest? Many of us are not accessing or even being denied, or not accessing because we've been denied social services and healthcare, not being able to change legal documents to reflect who we are now, which can lead to severe depression. And we're going to go much more in depth into this next week. But just a little snapshot for trans women. Going back to the Trans Pulse survey again. And remember, unfortunately, I still have Tourette's. It doesn't go away. 61.2% of trans women experience depression, and over 66% of trans men experience depression. And if that's not bad enough, 77% of the participants in the Trans Pulse survey admitted that they have seriously contemplated suicide. We're going to break that down and examine some of the reasons why a little bit next week. But this impact is significant for many of us.
Another very eye-opening statistic is that 41% of trans people have actually attempted suicide.
Yeah. And again, we'll get into all that uplifting information next week. So we're going to take a break, but not you. We're going to show you an incredible movie. So I really love this. Don't worry, it's not 3 hours long, which pisses me off about the Avengers, by the way. I can't sit still for that long. But anyway. Sorry, still have tracks. So we are going to talk about the kinds of questions that trans and non-binary folks often go. But before we go into that, we would like to hand it over to someone. If you don't know who Janet Mock is, I really highly recommend you reading her work. She wrote an amazing book called Redefining Realness, which is very relevant to the conversation we're having. Now, because we can't play the video audio through your conference call
about you is that if I were to look at you,
we're going to mute ourselves.
So
And I'm going to give you a minute. So you're all going to unmute your computer speakers. So if they're not unmuted, make sure your computer speakers are unmuted because the sound's going to come through your video, through your computer.
You have to both unmute your computer speakers as well as make sure that the speaker at the top of your Adobe Connect portal is green. So that little speaker icon has to be green.
And then also just make sure your computer speakers are not just unmuted but turned up.
I promise it's worth the effort, folks.
And then once the video is finished, we'll get you to mute your computer speakers again.
So I'm just going to give another few seconds just in case. Okay, we're good.
So I'm here with Alicia Menendez. First off, you're beautiful.
Thank you.
And what's so amazing about you is that if I were to look at you, I would have never not known that you weren't trans. So who was the first person you told your cis to?
I have never been asked or felt the need to tell anyone that I was cis.
Do you have a vagina? When was the moment that you felt your breast budding? Did you use tampons?
I thought we were going to talk about my show.
Well, I think we need to get through this. These are just the preliminary questions. When you were going through puberty, did you feel trapped by the changes your body was going through? Did you feel like a girl?
I don't even know what that would feel like because I was told that I was.
Do you feel that your idea of self, your cisness, holds you back in any way? Just the one thing. What do they need to know about cis people? I think you're incredibly brave to be a cisgendered woman in this world. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. That was so, wait, that was awful. Like we wrote a lot of these questions and I didn't realize how awful, like even when we were role playing them without you, I didn't realize how awful and invasive some of them would feel and how I feel now like a token.
Well, right. I think that's kind of the experience I go through every single time I'm in an interview. And even the good ones, you know, I still feel as if I'm carrying the burden of people that they're expecting me to communicate all of these things, but then also to give off all this private information about my body and my journey and my life. And, you know, I am very open in my book, so I understand why I'm in that space. But at the same time, I think some of the questions aren't necessary, right? Like the questions about your body. Why do we need to know that?
When I was coming into this, I thought we needed to know that as a way of bridging an understanding gap. But when you have the questions turned on you, I understand how much more intimate those questions feel and how they get away from the identity piece of this, which for me has a lot to do with my body, but doesn't necessarily for everyone have to do with the physicality of their sex or their gender.
Yeah, what I found so interesting is how uncomfortable I felt asking, but also when I was asking you the questions, I came from a space of entitlement of saying you need to prove to me that your identity in your body is real. And I'm going to ask you these questions because I need to investigate and really make sure that your identity and your body is real and authentic. Like that's where I was coming from. And I found myself taking on that role. And I kept on going to the default, because I've heard this so many times, well, our viewers really want to know. And this is something people want to know.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you want to know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not really like your viewers want to know, but it's an easy space to kind of go to.
Yeah, wow. Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, folks, now mute your computer speakers, otherwise you'll get feedback from the conference call line. So before we move on, I just want to check in with folks. I hope you thought that video was as worth it to show as I did. So multiple people are typing. I'm just going to give you guys a minute. I loved it. Yeah. So the link is on the video. Slide. But you can actually, and you'll get the printout of the PDF that will read the link. So it's totally, or you can just copy it right now, or you can just YouTube Janet Mock, Alicia Mendez interview. And it really is, I found it, I used to show other videos or talk about this issue, and I just found it so amazing. So I'm so glad that you guys enjoyed that too. I see some folks are still typing. I'm just going to move it along, but I will come back to that chat box and make sure we address. So you enjoyed it, but puts his gender on the spot to show uncomfortable ladies to speak to someone. Oh my God, Eugene, that's a perfect setup for what I'm going to talk about next. So I'm going to share with you guys a few of the common questions that I get. I'm not sure if Tina wants to add any. Are you a boy or girl? What surgeries have you had? I'm sure everyone here wants to talk about their hemorrhoid surgery that they had last fall. Sorry, I felt like I wasn't making enough jokes. Nothing wrong with hemorrhoids. Are you on hormones? Oh, this is one of my favorites. Are you the way you are because you were abused as a child? I was very abused as a child, but that's actually why I'm fucking hilarious. Okay, and my absolute favorite, do you have a penis or a vagina? Dun, dun, dun. So, most of us, it's just honest, sincere, genuine curiosity. But I think Janet Mock makes an excellent point towards the end of the video. Sometimes it's actually about validation. Remember we were talking about that subtle, indirect transphobia, but like real. Are you a real enough woman? If you have a vagina, if you have breasts, if you have X, Y, Z, and don't have ABC, then okay, I can accept you. And it's really problematic. But as human beings, we're constantly categorizing and creating more categories to categorize and box people in. So I have a few suggestions I can make, but we're going to do another little exercise again. So just type in that text box. What are strategies we could use when we want to ask these questions, but don't want to intrude or be disrespectful? Come on, guys. You can do it. Don't be afraid. It's anonymous. Don't. Just mind your business. Oh, sorry. It's not anonymous. You don't? We are not sure why we would even have to ask. So, okay. A lot of don't ask. So I'm glad that you guys are saying that, but I want to acknowledge the majority of people like to ask questions. So whether you want it or not, I'm going to give you a strategy that I find helpful. I think if someone comes out to you as trans or gender non-binary, the first thing to do is to thank them. Thank you for trusting me with that information. It's real, it's honest, it values the courage that it takes for some of us to do that. Thank you for trusting me with that information. I'd be open to a conversation with you if you ever want to talk about that further. So you acknowledge, one, thank you. Two, you'd be open to a conversation. But three, if you ever want to, you're putting the power and the control to decide whether or not that person wants to engage in a conversation about their trans and non-binary and gender identity experience in their hands. Like they get to control what they talk about and when they talk about it. And I think it's as simple as that. Lots of other variations, but those key things, thankful, and the power remains in the person's hands to decide. So we're going to move over to, well, first I'm going to pause just a minute. We're about to get into the Q&A, but we're going to talk about how to be an ally to trans and non-binary folks. And I haven't mentioned before, but if you don't recognize the way folks is spelled, it's to be more inclusive of the spectrum and the web and the fluidity of gender. So it's very similar to a lot of movements where people are spelling instead of Latino or Latino, it's Latin and then an X, just to acknowledge that there's more options. So actually, Tina's going to review most of these with you, and I might interject with a few tips of my own, but I'll hand it over.
Cool. So what are some things that we can do personally or professionally to be allies to trans folks?
Type like the wind. Have at it. Let us know. What are some ways that we can use this, both personally and professionally? And again, remember, the professional pieces and tips and tools will come next week more in depth. Educate yourself is an excellent point. We're actually going to talk about that next week as well. That's in relation to the medical community and services that a lot of trans folks experience. A lot of us are having to do the education ourselves. Open and humble, yes. Be a nice person. Speak out against discrimination. Absolutely. I remember when I was doing a workshop in person for another provincial organization, and they asked, what do they do if they hear something transphobic? And my question is, and I'm not comparing the different oppressions, and I'm not putting them on a hierarchy, but if someone said something, my question to that person was, if someone said something racist, would you say something? And her reply was yes. And I was like, then I think it's important that you address all kinds of oppression. And the reason why I asked that question, because some people aren't as comfortable addressing oppression. And I'm okay with that. I'm actually someone who chooses sometimes not to for my own safety and conservation of energy. I experience so much daily microaggressions and oppression. I just can't. I can't. And I think that that's okay. Giving space, knowing when to step back. Policy practice review. We'll get into that again next week. Lead by example. Be aware of the services within your area. Excellent point. Okay, we're going to move on.
These are all great examples. I think a great example of allyship that I experienced the other day, I was seeing my doctor, and we were talking about my hemoglobin, and it was kind of jumping up and down a bit, and she explained to me, that since I don't have periods, that's like not really normal and something that she wants to investigate. And instead of, when she explained it to me, instead of saying, so because you're biologically male, she didn't say that. Instead she said, so for somebody who's assigned male at birth, the hemoglobin shouldn't be jumping up and down. And the fact that she used assigned male at birth instead of biologically male really showed to me that she did her research, and she went out of her way to make sure that that the language that she uses is more something that will make me feel comfortable. And like, I felt great. Like, I thought it was so awesome.
The way when that kind of thing happens to me, I feel seen. It's like the best way that I can explain it. And the weight of that is not awesome.
Yeah.
To be seen when I spent most of my life feeling so invisible. I do want to point out, if you haven't signed up for the Beyond next week, please do. We are going to go way more in depth about inclusive language to use when you're working with a client.
So, being an ally, if you aren't sure, ask politely which pronouns to use. And now some people might say, I think this was kind of mentioned earlier, sometimes asking for pronouns or about somebody's pronouns can be a little thorny because it might indicate to the person like, wow, I'm not passing, or I look very in between. That's why it's very good to, I remember somebody mentioned earlier in respectful ways to ask about pronouns is to share your own pronouns and then ask about the person's pronouns, which normalizes everything. In my other job, when we have meetings, for example, when we all have our group and we introduce ourselves, we do our check-in, we all share our pronouns. So by making it something, sharing the pronouns being something that everybody does, it doesn't feel so othering where when you ask somebody what their pronouns are. Use the pronoun that you've been asked to use, because the previous thing is not very useful if you don't actually follow through with it. And correct others if they use the wrong pronoun. But as mentioned earlier, ask first. Sometimes people go by different pronouns in different contexts. For example, people might go by this set of pronouns in queer spaces, but out in the hetero world, they go by this set of pronouns. So
yeah, and that's actually, I only changed the name that I had people refer to me as professionally a couple of years ago, but in my personal life, I've been going by Frankie for almost a decade. And also, before I was on hormones, my passing wasn't consistent. And when I go into a new place, like a restaurant, and then I clear my throat, as I always do. But then the server would come and say, oh, good afternoon, ladies, or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or that kind of thing. And I was just like, okay, I'm a woman today. I'm going to use the women's restroom. I'm going to go by female pronouns. And it was much more not that, like, I didn't want to, like, stick up for who I was, but I didn't want my food to fit in. I didn't want to get bad service. Again, a lot of this is linked. Unfortunately, that's my choice. Not everyone does. But going back to my earlier point, I deal with so much daily harassment that, like, I sometimes choose that I'm just not going to deal with it. And I think that that's totally okay. That's what's not only safe for me in the world physically, but safer for my mental health.
So don't ask about surgeries and hormones unless they've given you permission to. And this is kind of a courtesy that should be applied to everybody. Medical stuff is personal and it's not really anybody's business unless they choose to talk about it. Don't call someone by their old or dead name. So dead name is a term that is used in the trans community to refer to a person's name before they transition. Use their current chosen name. Don't out others as trans. And on forms, don't use just male or female. It can be a little complex as to how to include everybody, and there isn't really exactly a right or wrong answer. But me personally, if I am filling out forms, it's good to have male, female, maybe options for trans woman, trans man, non-binary. For sometimes personally, I think the best way would be just put gender and a line so that there's no check boxes. You can put whatever you want.
Or another example is if you have to have male or female, and then you can have a box that says please specify and have a line. From a decade of working with youth, I learned that you should not write sex and then a blank line because you'll more often than not just get the answer yes. I think it's also important to acknowledge some folks are legally bound to use and to record and ask for the names on identification. So at a hospital, you need to have the sex that matches what is on the person's OHIP card. However, that doesn't mean that just because that's what you have to record on paper doesn't mean it's what you have to say out loud when you're calling the person. I go to an amazing clinic that's extremely, not just LGBT friendly, like just, they are the LGBT clinic, health clinic. And before I had changed all my documentation, yes, they had my legal name, yes, they had my legal sex, but they had options in their software that came up and popped up every time I would check in that had my name that I go by and I was going to say for pronouns. And the pronoun that I use flagged so that whoever was greeting me, if they didn't know me, would be aware of that. So there are little tips and tools. And again, we'll get into more next week, but I did want to share that with you all.
Advocate for gender-neutral bathrooms and be a bathroom guard for somebody using a gendered bathroom. When I was in high school and I was starting to I was growing my hair out and wearing makeup and presenting feminine, I had to stop using the men's washroom because what would happen is when I used the men's washroom, people would say, "Oh, excuse me, miss, I think you're mistaken. The women's washroom's over there." So, but even though people thought I belonged in the women's washroom, since it was a new thing to me, I was very nervous and I was afraid that I would get kicked out or whatever. So a lot of my friends at the time, a thing that they did to support me, which was absolutely awesome, and I thank them for it so much, is being a bathroom guard. You know, going in with me, ready to defend me if needed, or make sure that there's nobody using the washroom. Those are such amazing examples of being allies, and I am forever grateful for my friends for being bathroom guards for me when I was first using the women's washroom. Also being honest about what you do and don't know, because if you don't know about something, it's good to state that so the person you're interacting with can kind of know how to interact with you more. And really, respect is the key. If you are overwhelmed or overthinking it, really it goes down to respect. And I 100% agree with what Frankie says. As long as we see that you're trying, that's really the number one thing.
Now there was a question earlier. So when you say don't ask about surgery or hormones, are you recommending that our nurse practitioners should not attempt to educate our clients about surgery or hormone options? That's not what I'm saying. That's in a specific context. I'm talking about like a one-on-one interaction where if it's information you don't need to know and that's not relevant to the conversation, that's when, if it's not relevant, don't ask. What would happen with more surgical options that were provided, my doctor would ask me, there are new options for XYZ. Let me know if you'd like more information on them. And it's, again, letting me know that there's a conversation we can have, but leaving the power in my hand. Now, we have quite a number of questions, so I'm just going to speed through this just a little bit. One of the handouts is the Being an Effective Trans Ally, and one of the things I like about this is it talks about the different ways to support. So know when to sit aside, be in front, or be behind someone. And that's kind of critical. And then I want to talk about a couple of other resources, but just to kind of close things off, and I'm going to bring it full circle, going back to the stem and the root of where this all comes from, the gender binary system. So pizza rolls, not gender roles. And if you want to know the gender neutral term for sugar mama or sugar daddy, it's glucose cardiac. That's not copyrighted yet, so feel free to use. So we're going to take a moment to ask questions. Okay, well, maybe you have questions. Tina and I are going to look at the question box and see what we need to answer and address right now, but feel free to type away or raise your hand if you want to jump on the call. So hopefully that answered the question when we reviewed documents about more than male or female on each form. And then there's another question. Can we mention that gender binary came along? Oh yeah, well, I believe I talked about that already. Is there anything else? So if some folks are having issues downloading the resources, we will send them out. If you need them sooner than the follow-up goes, please just get in touch with us. And on that note, while people are typing their questions, I'm just going to make use of the time and make sure you guys know about a couple of peer-run programs. So in Ontario, the LGBT Youth Line is run by LGBT youth who are under the age of 27 for LGBT youth who are under the age of 27. And the Trans Youth Line is both in Canada and the States, and it's run by trans folks to support other trans folks who may be in crisis. A lot of the resources box, if you can download them, if not, don't worry, we'll send them in a link later on. There's the full set of definitions, the tips on being an ally, words that are transphobic that you might not even be thinking about, cisgender privileges. What are ways that you're moving through this world that you might not even be aware that you can do and some of us can't? That gender binary system comic, that language for to post in your restroom, but what to do or not do if you think people are on the wrong one. A beautiful article written by Ivan Coyote about Dear Lady in the Women's Washroom. And then we have some provincial resources sheets. And if you are a data geek, there's a PDF of the slides, which I used a lot to talk about during the presentation. Now, I hope you enjoyed this, but I have to make it clear there's homework. But I'm here and I'm queer, so I like to call it homework. Plan A. Just for one day. Just one day. Try using gender-neutral washrooms for just one day. If you can, at least take note of when you see a gender-neutral washroom and when you don't. And we have a handy little back worksheet that you can print out or load up on your tablet to be able to do the exercise. Jen, we talked about certificate of completion of participation. You can email us and we'll send you the instructions. But the name of the webinar, the month that you completed it, the date you completed it, your name, and then we'll send you a survey right now and later on that you can fill out. Let us know how we did.
You can click that link right.
Oh.
And if you're able to click that link, and it'll take you straight to the survey while we refresh. We will send it again later, but we really do appreciate feedback. We're constantly looking to improve what we do.
Yes. And on that note, that's our info. Hit us up if you need any of the resources sent to you. We will send a follow-up email with everything, but if you need it for some reason sooner, if you need a certificate, that's where that goes to. But if you're taking both webinars, please wait until the end. We can send you a certificate for both. And if you are not signed up for Beyond, please join us because we will be here next week. Thanks, everyone, so much. Thank you to Tina, who I just really enjoyed presenting with. And thank you to Nick and Kim for all the behind the scenes. It takes a lot of work to put these together. It takes a village. And I'm very, very happy to be part of this very queer and trans village. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much for being a part of this. It's been an absolute honor talking with all of y'all. And yeah, thank you so much. And just the fact that you signed up for this webinar, I think is already a great show of allyship.
Agreed.
See some people next week.
We'll see some of you next week. I will still have Tourette's.